what we're going to talk about today is we will first go through some introductory information, talk about the importance of this energy source and the background, kind of its history. Then we're going to go through, and I'm hoping to walk you through some just fundamental understanding of what is the resource, how do we exploit it, how do we use it, how do we actually generate power from it. Then we'll go through a little bit more about that actual exploration process. How do we find it? How do we develop it? What are the technologies that we use to actually generate electricity and or heat from it? Then we're going to take a quick little break, watch a fun video. And then we will dive into my personal expertise here, which is the market and the economics of the resource and sort of the future potential. And then we'll go through some case studies and successes. Okay, so geothermal is an extremely important resource. Of course, I am saying that because I'm working in the industry, but it is an important player in the sustainable energy transition, although it is at the moment a small player, but we're seeing that accelerating.
So why is the use of geothermal energy accelerating? Well, it's because it's a really important key player in the transition to a sustainable energy future. And the dynamics of why we might be seeing a resurgence now are actually pretty simple to understand. As we are seeing more actual legislation and laws and regulations that are backing up clean energy goals and a transition to a clean energy future, we are also seeing the increase in demand for geothermal or 24/7 firm clean power. Let me explain. Let's take here in the United States, for example. We used to have 30 states that had renewable portfolio standards. These required that you have a certain voluntary or mandatory reduction of carbon over time. But now we're also seeing 18 states that have a 100% clean energy goal or GHG reduction standards. These require not just that you get to a certain percentage of reduction in your carbon on your electric system, but a 100% reduction. So how do we do that? How do electricity providers get to a 100% reduction? Well, of course, they're going to use a large percentage of the cheapest renewable carbon-free assets that they can find first. These are currently wind and solar. The wind and solar industry has done an amazing job deploying those assets in rapid fashion. And so those are now in large numbers on certain grids. But they're also inherently intermittent. Sun only works when the sun is shining. Wind only works when the wind is blowing. And so if you are in one of these states or countries or companies who wants to get to truly 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, carbon-free electricity, you need something else to fill the gap. And your choices are pretty limited on what you can use. So geothermal is one of your really only already viable resources. This is quite simply why we're seeing an acceleration right now. A good example of this acceleration is, or rather maybe an anecdote of how this is playing out, is you can look again here in California at the midterm reliability ruling, which was released in June of 2021. And what this ruling was essentially the California Public Utilities Commission, in anticipation of the retirement of the Diablo Canyon nuclear facility here in the state, which, by the way, produced like 10% of our electricity in 2022, said, if we are to truly retire that, we absolutely need to make sure that we're still replacing it with true carbon-free 24/7 electricity. How can we do that? Partially, we can do it through batteries and long-term storage. But we also need something that has an 80% capacity factor or higher and has no on-site emissions. That's essentially geothermal by another name. So these types of legislation that are starting to fall out in high intermittent or renewable energy penetrated grids are just an example of why geothermal is really playing a larger and larger role in the sustainable energy future. But I may be getting a bit ahead of myself. Let's talk about the history.
I've said a couple of times, it's been a typically limited resource. That is true, but it's also one of the oldest renewable generation sources. And so geothermal, not new. It's been around since the 1800s. It has been deployed essentially ever since humans have walked the earth. They have been using heat from the earth for different methods. First geothermal plant was actually in Italy, the Lardello plant outside of Tuscany, in as early as the 1900s. So, you see that you've gone through these sort of periods of time. You've had the first geothermal plant, 1904. Then you kind of had this period of people not really using too much of this source commercially. But then you had this very massive period of growth in the 60s and throughout the 80s. And that was really paved by legislation. I'm speaking specifically about the United States here, but wanted to highlight and start with this because as a geothermal developer, for me, the effects of legislation and broader understanding of the importance of a resource really have a big impact on how widely it's deployed. And so you can see that, in 1978, PURPA was enacted. That paved the way for independent power producers to begin producing geothermal energy. And then when you had another important legislation with tax credits in 2008, you had additional deployments. And we can really see this better if we look at this sort of graphically in terms of the installed capacity. So what I'm showing here is just a graph of nameplate capacity of existing installed geothermal. And I was just talking about PURPA, and you can see in the 1980s that enactment, and you can see almost instantaneously the overall installation of geothermal continue. This slide also highlights an important aspect of geothermal in terms of how the capacity factor can be different in the summer and the winter. But we'll go through that a little bit more after I've given you some of the fundamentals of how the surface facility works so that you can understand. Okay, so that was your background. That was your introduction in history, your 5-minute quick introduction to history to geothermal. Now let's talk about the fundamentals. What the heck am I talking about when I say geothermal energy? Really, what are we talking about here? So we're going to go through what is the origin of geothermal energy, what are the applications and sort of current locations, what are the key principles and methods and processes of extraction. You've been through studying energy this entire quarter, so I'm sure you've talked a lot about this, but almost all energy can really be boiled down to a form of nuclear energy, and geothermal is no different in the fact that part of the processes of the geothermal energy that we are talking about today is actually radiogenic heat. About 50% of that is really left over from just radioactive decay. But because the Earth is such a very dense and great insulator, 50% of that is actually left over from the creation of the Earth. So I don't know about you, but I think that's pretty cool that I get to take something that was created 4.5 billion years ago and use it for powering our modern lives and global economy. Okay, so what are we talking about here? When I talk about geothermal energy, really there's two types of geothermal energy that I'm talking about in this lecture. I'm talking about geothermal energy, which is used for direct heat. So this is, essentially using the direct heat for purposes of anything that you're going to use the heat for in an industrial processes, perhaps agricultural, perhaps manufacturing. And then I'm also talking about geothermal energy for electricity production. Those are the only two things that we're really going to cover in this lecture. There's also heat pumps, which they've been through. So you guys we won't talk about that. But I love this slide. It's one of my favorite that your teaching team put together because to me, it really demonstrates, it says so much in this single slide. It talks about how prevalent are these two types of geothermal energy, where are they located, and we can even talk about really cool things about why they're located there and where are some future potential from this slide. So the orange dots on this slide are all geothermal power projects or installed geothermal facilities, and the blue is direct heat. So from here, I just have a general question for you all, some general observations about this map, locations. Why do you think that these are located where they are? Yes, tectonics, awesome, wonderful. Okay, so we're talking about accessing heat from the core, right? So I said the rock is a very good insulator. So where we're gonna get more accessible heat is where the Earth's crust is lower or where we have certain geological principles where we're gonna be able to have that heat actually rising to the surface. So that's why you see these projects clustered around where you see specific plate tectonic activity, where the plates are either pulling or pushing together, where you're having those types of events. Okay, so we talked about this. This is the direct use versus electricity. Let's talk about how important or how significant it is. So direct use is not my area of expertise, but we're starting to get into it a little bit more at Fervo. So I'll talk a little bit about it, but really my expertise is on geothermal electricity and power production, and so happy to answer a lot of questions on that, but the main growth for direct use is in China right now. It is pretty site specific, but there's some exciting things that are happening that we'll talk about. I already mentioned some of the direct applications, agricultural, water, recreation, these types of things. And then for electricity, I've said probably 3 times already through the course of this lecture that it's a small part of the energy mix. It's less than 1% of the world and the US's electricity markets. And in the past, it's been pretty site-specifically located, and we saw why in that earlier map. But it is extremely valuable where it is located. And we are seeing a really significant resurgence of geothermal, and particularly in the binary cycle space where there are truly zero emissions. All right, so that's generally what we're talking about, those two types of energy. So how do we find it? How do we find where we can actually get geothermal at an economic rate? Well, we need to find kind of this magic trifecta, or at least historically, we needed to find this magic trifecta, where you have the 3 things that you really need for geothermal energy. So first and foremost, you need to have a heat source. You need to have water or another element that you can use through convection to convey that heat source to the surface. And then historically, you've also needed to find the exact right location where there's permeability in the rock, right? We're going down into the earth, we're finding where the heat source is. We need there to be permeability so that the water can flow through that rock, as you can see on that picture, so that we can pull it up and then extract the heat for purposes of electricity generation. Historically, that's been pretty hard to find because, this heat source is directly resultive of how high or how deep do we need to go to get to that heat source. So a good geothermal hydro resource typically is anywhere from, depending on the temperature, the technology you're using, anywhere from around 300 degrees C to 170 is about the lowest temperatures that you can use to efficiently convert this to electricity, geothermal electricity. So you can see now why you need to be shallow, right? Because what we're doing to get to this electricity is we need to actually drill down into the earth. And this is a typical, what we call geothermal temperature wellbore log, temperature log. And you can kind of see that this temperature distribution around the earth is not uniform, right? Just because the earth's surface is not uniformly thick around the entire to space. And so essentially, you need to be able to drill to a place where you can economically do so. And so in a typical geothermal hydro resource, you would be able to get to this temperature, this bottom hole temperature of 265 C. This is a pretty good geothermal hydro resource by going to about 3,000 feet.
By contrast, in many places in the world, accessing these same temperatures would require you to go much deeper, magnitudes of 3 or 4 times that depth. And this matters because the further you have to drill down, the more expensive the well is, and therefore the more difficult it becomes to economically develop that resource.
That's something that, Fervo's key innovation is, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But before we can do that, we got to talk a little bit more about those exploration methods, the types of geothermal plants, and emerging technologies, which Fervo will be one of them. Okay, so before you go, and I'm just going to put all of these up now. Okay, so before you can actually start converting geothermal energy to electricity, you have to find that right trifecta. So how does the industry typically do that? Well, they first start with geological, geophysics, and chemistry assessments. We can do things like LiDAR mapping, radars, geomagnetic surveys, where we think that we might have a good geothermal resource. So we start there. But then, in order to actually confirm that, really, historically, the only way to confirm that temperature has been to do actual drilling, to get some real results, drill into the earth and understand where the temperature, what the actual bottom hole temperature is. So that's kind of phase 2. You have to drill a test well. Once you have a test well, then you can start testing that well, where you start to look for characters of flow. That's where you're actually starting to test for your permeability, other elements that you need that we talked about in that trifecta. Then you do a very complicated geophysical model and reservoir model, and you decide what your actual power density is going to be, and if you're going to have a viable economical resource. So that's kind of how we look for these resources. So how do we actually drill for them? There's a lot of similarities to the oil and gas space. So Tim Latimer, who's a founder of Fervo, comes from the oil and gas space. He was an oil and gas engineer. Honestly, still even to this day, probably 80% of Fervo are people from the oil and gas space, oil and gas engineers. And so there's a lot of similarities, but there's some differences. The similarities is, you do need to find land leasing, you need to have geothermal resource, you need to have the right to access that resource. You can utilize the same drilling rigs, and essentially the process of drilling for the just transition for oil and gas workers is essentially the same. But there is some key differences, and this is really where Fervo has spent the first 5 years of existence sort of proving up and making sure that we can do these techniques that the oil and gas space has been using for years in the geothermal space, and happy to report that we have now proven, conclusively that you can and have published those results. But the key differences are you have to drill through much harder rock. Oil and gas basins are typically in sedimentary rock. Usually when we're talking about these good geothermal reservoirs, we tend to find much harder rock. We obviously have higher temperatures than oil and gas because that's exactly what we're looking for, we're targeting. And then we also need to look at different types of regions and locations historically. So those are some of the challenges, but there's so many similarities between drilling. Want to just say quickly focus really quickly on mineral rights. So I mentioned that one of the similarities between oil and gas is that you need to have the legal right to access this geothermal resource. One of the main challenges for developing geothermal resources has been, both internationally and here domestically, the differences in the way that geothermal regulations and laws are treated. And so if you think about what is geothermal, we are using water, but it's also subsurface. And so depending on which state or region you're in, and domestically here in the United States, they will consider that either a mineral or a water right. And so it tends to a lot of inefficiencies in sort of when you're actually going through the development process, which if you are interested, we don't have a whole lot of time to go into how geothermal development, how an actual project is created. But if you're very interested in that, actually, I teach a course here at Stanford on geothermal process development where we actually go through and do a full feasibility study of an actual project. This is just one of the many challenges that you will have. Okay, so earlier I said that some geothermal is truly carbon-free, some is not. I want to just pause on this really quickly because this is really important when we're talking about renewable energies. We need to talk about all of the offsets and implications that they may have from an environmental perspective. So geothermal is, some types of geothermal is completely carbon-free. That is binary cycle, but there are potentials for emissions on other types of geothermal, like flash and steam, which we haven't gone into yet, but that will make sense in just a second. And essentially, this boils down to the fact that anytime you're going subsurface, you need to be very careful and understanding of what is it that you're going to access when you get down to that fluid. Is there going to be, high amounts of sulfur dioxide or methane included in that water? And if there is, are you having an appropriate mitigation plan for that? If you're going to be having any of that fluid that is released into the air and surfaces, are you appropriately accounting for that? In a binary system, we'll see later, it stays completely closed-looped, so there's never actually any exposure of the fluid that you're extracting from the earth into the atmosphere, and that's why we can say it's truly environmentally net zero. So, okay. So I just said permitting is very important. Evaluating all of the environmental impacts in association with any renewable energy is extremely important. However, in an industry that has been typically small like this and is now growing, you'll always see natural inefficiencies. And so I have included this slide. I won't talk very much about it, just to say that in the geothermal industry space and in my day-to-day life, we have this problem very much right now where we have some permitting inefficiencies where, in fact, when you're doing geothermal permitting, you may end up studying the same well in the same project 7 separate times. And you should study environmental impacts, but maybe not the same thing 7 times. So one of the things that in my class we talk about how to streamline and things that need to be fixed. Okay. But I do want to talk about, all right, so far, just to review, we've gone, how do we find the resource? Once we find it, how do we get it up? Now that's at the surface, how do we actually convert that to electricity? Okay, there are 3 typical ways that this is done in the geothermal energy space right now. Dry steam, flash steam, and binary plants. The largest difference is dependent on the temperature resource, the temperature of the hydrothermal resource that you are finding. They go typically, in terms of binary cycles, are used when you have a lower temperature resource. That's about 16% of the world capacity today. You usually have anywhere from 100 C. Honestly, I've not really seen binary plants work totally effectively below 110 C. So 110 C to about 212 is where they max out. Then if you have a hydrothermal resources that hotter than that, typically you will put something called a flash steam where you actually are using the direct steam. And if you go beyond that, you can actually use a dry steam where you use the actual resource and the steam directly into a turbine. So what do I mean by that? In case you are not a power plant engineer, let's talk about that. Here are these 3 sources and what their sort of process flow of what this looks like. All right, so let's go low temperature to high temperature. Okay, binary cycle plant, low temperature plant. You are taking the geothermal fluid from the subsurface, you're pumping it into a heat exchanger. That heat exchanger then is using usually a working fluid like an isopropane or a butane to then heat that working fluid up. That working fluid is then used to turn a turbine and a generator, and then it's recondensed where it goes back down into the heat exchanger and the fluid goes back down into the surface. So you can see in that cycle why you would essentially have none of your fluid from the subsurface being released into the atmosphere. You never really have any exposure of that fluid to above ground conditions. Flash steam, now we're moving up in temperature. Flash, the way that this works is essentially, this means that the fluid is so hot that it's not just water that's coming up. Essentially, you are having some steam as well. And so if you have steam coming up from the ground and the surface, you will have something where you need to come in, you need to do a separator, so where you separate the steam as well from the fluid, the hot fluid that you're getting. Those then are, through different mechanical processes, work to go into turning a steam turbine, and same thing for a generator. Okay, now to the hottest, which is typically anywhere from 235 degrees Celsius to 455 degrees. So for this one, it's even hotter temperatures. If you have temperatures at that extreme, you're using the steam directly. This is something that the geysers does, where you essentially, the resource is so close to the surface of the earth that you can economically drill to use, where you're using direct steam. But as I mentioned, when you drill down to the Earth's surface, you may have other chemicals or things present just naturally in the Earth, and that's why sometimes you can have limited emissions with this type of unit, and also why it's not the main growth sector of geothermal currently. Okay, so here is where we talk about just a little bit of plant technology recently. Almost all of it has been binary cycle deployments. That's all I'm gonna say about that. Where is this industry going? Okay, so starting in the 2000s, basically everything here in the United States has been binary cycle in that lower temperature. You're seeing that trend for a couple of reasons. One, it's a lower temperature resource, meaning usually it's easier to access in terms of the economics. But then also, we talked about earlier in the very beginning of the lecture that the main driver here for geothermal has been this combination of sustainable energy goals, right? So if you're having sustainable energy goals and you want to be deploying carbon-free resources, it's another driving factor. Almost all of the geothermal is in the West, and lucky you are at school in the state where the largest amount of geothermal is actually located via the geysers I mentioned earlier. It is a steam cycle, but they have recently done a few binary cycles as well here in California. Okay, so what's the potential? We'll talk more and more about this in the market section, but this is just to say the potential for geothermal, particularly binary cycle or low temperature geothermal in the US, to serve as that sort of final picture in truly sort of standing up intermittent renewable resources is huge. You can see from this map, which is an estimation that SMU did of geothermal resources, that here in the West, at 7 kilometers deep, we have a potential of, on the very low end, 120 gigawatts of power that could be easily accessible through technology innovations. And that is really the premise of why Fervo exists and why I stay very, very busy. So you compare that with only the 2.6 gigawatts now that's installed, and then you think about, okay, that's a very low estimate is 120 gigawatts, and Tim Latimer will, if you Google his name, you will see all day long how he talks about how that is a very, very low estimate. And why do we think that? We think that because one of the key innovations, and this is now getting into what my company does, is we are working in what's called enhanced geothermal. So enhanced geothermal, if you remember back to that diagram where I said you need the three things, what EGS says and does is it says, okay, what if we didn't have to have that exact parameters, those three things? What if we could create our own permeability? And all we needed was to find the heat and the water, because we know those two things are pretty prevalent at depths which are economic to drill to. So in its very, very simplest form, enhanced geothermal is just taking away that third element by using completion techniques that were used in the oil and gas space to actually create your own permeability. We reviewed, this is just to say this is the development process I've given you a ton of information about how you find the geothermal resource, how you drill for the geothermal resource, what you do with it once you get it to the surface. But all of that does not happen on its own. It's a process. It's a development process, and that's what my course talks about, which is this process, which is you have to seek and obtain the land, you have to do your drilling, you have to confirm your resource and temperature, you need to physically interconnect into the grid, you need to contract and pay for all of that, and there's a very unique risk profile to doing so. Let Bernie tell us about binary cycle and what this can do for communities.
Alaska has more geothermal energy than all the states put together. But yet Chena Hot Springs is the first geothermal power plant in the state of Alaska. Now this power plant is making power off of water that's not as hot as McDonald's coffee.
We developed lower temperature technology, so you don't have to go after 300 or 400 degree water or steam.
This is working. We're doing it. I mean, the lights are on right now geothermally. Now we're going to enter the largest ice structure in the world to be up all summer. Now Forbes magazine voted this the dumbest business idea of the year. Mr. Forbes can kiss my ass. This entire structure is kept cold geothermally. It cost me about $12 a day to refrigerate this place. If you did it on diesel fuel standard, it would be $750 a day. It's the cheapest thing going. Our electricity was costing us 30 cents a kW. Right now, we're at 5 cents a kW. In 3 to 4 years, we'll be 1 penny per kilowatt hour. We'll have the cheapest energy in the state of Alaska.
Bernie doesn't know why it's not done, but we do. And we can talk a little bit about it. Let's do that. Let's talk about why it's not been done before and how much it is being done.
But first, before I do, I need to shout out one of my fellow Fervo colleagues. Shown on the screen here, the New York Times business section front page, is Emma McConville, who is currently the Senior Manager of Geoscience for Fervo Energy. And this was an article that was run earlier this year on the just transition of oil and gas workers. And Emma started her career as a geoscientist and quickly got a job at ExxonMobil, where she was using her excellent geological and reservoir understanding skills to essentially develop oil and gas resources. And about 3 years ago, Emma joined Fervo and has been using those same exact skills now to help us transition to a clean energy future. And I just think it's such a cool story of how the same supply chain, including the people, can be used from the oil and gas sector to help this resource really truly achieve its full potential.
So before we can talk about where the trends are, we've talked a lot about different things. Let's actually talk about some statistics and facts on how much energy we actually have right now that is geothermal. So right now, geothermal power, the US is actually number one in terms of the capacity installed, primarily due to the geysers and that giant steam field that has been developed here in Northern California. In terms of geothermal heat, China is number one. Growth leader for geothermal electricity prior to Fervo was actually not the United States. It was in Indonesia and Turkey. I had a great opportunity to actually go to Turkey and visit a whirlwind of 5 different geothermal plants in an afternoon. And that should give you an idea of how much geothermal there is, because these are typically very located out in rural areas. And the fact that I was able to go to 5 different plants operated by 5 different providers all within 3 hours should give you an idea of how much geothermal expansion really occurred there. So let's talk about globally. So there's about 99 terawatts of power being produced, or just under 0.3% of the world's capacity by geothermal, and only about 0.2% for direct heat. So this is still a pretty small part of the world energy mix. Direct heat is small. We talked about this, but let's look a little bit about what people are using the direct heat for. I mentioned they're using it for agriculture, recreation, and public works. Public works being, maybe heating sidewalks or even heating public pools and things like that. This graph just sort of gives you a breakdown of what they're using it for, but again, it's a fairly small portion compared to its actual potential. China has recognized this and really is growing in terms of the direct use and continues to do so. Fervo is doing electricity, so about 2.7 gigawatts are installed in the US. That number you will hear quoted quite differently depending on who you're talking to, but that's really because they're measuring capacity factor slightly different, or how they're measuring it and when they're measuring it. But
this picture is rapidly changing, in part due to Fervo's efforts. We've already announced that we intend on deploying 400 megawatts by 2028 that will support California's midterm reliability decision. And that's not all that's in our pipeline. We estimate that we have gigawatts of additional geothermal lease already under contract and are actively working on deploying that as quickly as possible.
So there is massive growth here in the electrical sector, both worldwide and domestically.
So while I hope I've demonstrated to you that there is growth today and a massive potential for growth, this slide really hammers home the point that it still is a small amount of the overall energy picture.
And you can see it's really only 2% of renewable energy. I'm going to keep this graph in here because I'm really hoping that in 5 years or 6 years when I come back, you're going to start to see that growing and growing and growing. This is also a good slide to talk about hydro. I like to pause here for a moment because anyone who's really interested in knowing really what a carbon-free grid looks like knows that hydro really is currently providing a very solid base, both hydro and nuclear in some markets, but here in the US it's hydro. And one of the effects that we're seeing with climate change is more persistent droughts and fires, and we're seeing that have a massive effect on hydroelectricity. At Fervo last year, we keep track of all of these things, and we saw an 80% swing in the amount of hydro being imported from the Pacific Northwest. I don't know, for true energy nerds, if we can talk about more about this later. It's massive in terms of what we're relying on. So all of that says is, we really do need to make sure we're replacing that bottom base with something that is really, truly reliable and carbon-free. So geothermal is that. Sometimes you will hear it referred to as a base load resource. When you hear it referred to as a base load resource, what they're talking about is just that it's on and consistent. And they may be referencing the capacity factor. So various capacity factors here, levelized capacity factors from the US Energy Information Administration of different renewable energy resources. Geothermal is consistently around 70, or really what we see with binary cycles is we're actually more around 84 to 90% capacity factor. That's a little bit lower. You'll notice it's not 100%, and you might wonder and say, why is that the case if it's just pulling heat up and it's on all the time? That's a particular function of the heat exchange process. These binary cycle plants can either be water-cooled or air-cooled, and when you have an air-cooled facility and it's hot outside, it's less efficient. So we see that in the summertime, these plants actually produce less electricity. Coincidentally, though, that is actually when we are producing the most wind and solar. So this actually means that it fits very, very well with some of the dynamics that we're seeing in the grids. At this point in the quarter, you've probably seen the duck quack, quack, quack. So we can talk kind of about interesting things about this later, if you'd like. in the Q&A session. But essentially, what I'll say is that geothermal can significantly flatten the duck because it can essentially help to decrease those evening and morning peaks. That's all I'll say about that. And because of that, that's why you see this procurement mandate like we saw at the California Public Utilities Commission. I talked about this in the beginning in my opening session, but California has recently mandated that all load-serving entities here in California procure at least 1,000 megawatts of clean energy by 2026. We are finding that due to a lot of these development challenges, 2026 had to be extended to 2028, and now there are some movements in the regulatory proceedings asking to extend that even slightly further, thus the need for very smart people like you all to really understand the challenges of developing geothermal and start to work on fixing those. But the point here, and what you should take away from this slide, is it's not just me standing in front of your industry telling you that this is needed. We're seeing that regulation is starting to follow. And there are actual tangible procurement mandates that are coming down to procure these high capacity factor resources. So what does that mean in terms of installed capacity and what will happen? And what are some of the differences between here domestically and internationally? Well, it means that we're seeing US, who is a global leader now, continuing to have massive growth. We're seeing other nations that have higher intermittent resources on their grids having increased interest in geothermal. And we're seeing some countries that I'd like to point out that have already sort of done this electricity mix well, continue to enact things that are really interesting and helpful in deploying this key resource. Kenya, which this was when I first got into the geothermal space, just fascinated me. I'm like, why does Kenya have 48% of their electricity as geothermal? I mean, it makes sense. They're on the Ring of Fire. They're on the Eastern African Rift. So tectonically, it makes sense. But why have they been able to deploy so much more power generation for geothermal than we have? And the answer turns out to be in large part due to some of the policies that they have for solving some of those early development challenges that I mentioned. Kenya actually has a very interesting grant program where they will allow developers who have identified a geothermal resource, and we went through those sort of 4 processes, right? Find the resource, confirm the resource, which is through drilling. And in case you're wondering, that can be anywhere from $2 to $5 million of capital, and you don't know if you actually have a project before you've done that. And so what Kenya has done is they've said, anybody who has a suspicion and reasonable evidence that they have a good geothermal resource can apply for this grant, and we will pay up to 2/3 of that cost to confirm it. And that's been extraordinarily effective, because it turns out when you tell people that I'm going to help you with the early de-risking of those dollars, they develop more and more geothermal energy. So that's one of the main reasons you see Kenya with a large percentage of their electricity as geothermal, and why it's continuing to increase. Okay, so I get this one a lot. I don't particularly like LCOE as a developer. I just have to say that, because it's not the way I look at my energy projects, and I'm happy to expand if anyone is interested. But it does do a good job of answering this question of, can geothermal energy truly be economic and effective? And the answer is absolutely yes. Currently, the LCOE for geothermal is somewhere between $61 to $102 on a levelized basis. This is from Lazar. It can be even cheaper if you are eliminating or drilling faster, right? Because it's all about how quickly do you actually drill to that resource. So if you can drill faster, you're going to have less cost. And if you can eliminate extraneating project costs, like drilling useless wells, because one of the things that happens in traditional geothermal is because you're looking for that trifecta, sometimes you'll drill down, you will find that you have heat, you will find that you have water, and you do not have that permeability. And because of that, you have what's completely an ineffective well. And I mentioned earlier, those are somewhere between 2 and 5 million a well. If you do that, and you've done that 4 or 5 times, 6 times in your project, all of a sudden you can very easily see how your cost of your project is higher than it needs to be. So that's how EGS is driving down sort of CapEx on a project, which for purposes of no one creating something better that we can all talk about all of the energies in the same way, we can talk about it in terms of levelized cost. Also, incentives can really help this. Tax credits can really have a huge impact on the levelized cost. You can see this is an estimation from Lazar on the impact of tax credits on the levelized cost of energy, and on a levelized basis, that brings that down significantly. So anyway, that's a little bit about the LCOE. So let's talk about, first, another colleague shout out, and also very cool. This is Fervo's first production well ever placed into commercial operation. So we completed our technology assessment or technology proof in 2019. And just earlier this year, that same project went fully commercial, meaning fully paid for, and is actually powering Google data centers. And Google has released some really cool press about that recently. This well is currently producing about 2.5 megawatts of electricity, totally carbon-free, via a method that, quite frankly, the entire world, including the scientific community and some people even here at Stanford, said we couldn't do. So we're doing it, and we can. And we'll talk about why and what that means. So what that means, though, is advancements like Fervo's technology means that this growth is just started and it's going to continue to accelerate. So this is, a graph that talks a little bit about the world expansion of geothermal, how much is installed by country, and then here you can really kind of see the differences by country, the type of geothermal as it's accelerating and predicted to accelerate. And this really makes sense when you think about it in terms of what we reviewed already now. Now you guys have the fundamentals of understanding why you might see in Asia the expansion of a different type of electricity versus, say, Turkey. You can see from both the temperature and the resource and the locationality why you might see more flash or traditional systems being installed there versus in Turkey or here in the Western United States. So heat continues to be, we're expecting that the heat is still going to continue to grow in China. There's some really interesting stuff happening here in the US, though, around direct air capture, and that is sort of having some knock-on effects for geothermal from a heat perspective, because it's turning out that finding that when you combined technologies and resources that you can sort of stack all of these up, and that the sum of the parts actually the sum of the whole is greater than the parts. So that's really interesting. Hopefully we'll have time to talk about it. Okay, so it's growing, but it's still a small portion. Let's talk about some of those cool things. So this is Orca plant, largest direct air capture plant in operation. It started in 2001. It's located in Iceland. It's a Climeworks project, and they are essentially using the synergies between the thermodynamic principles of geothermal to sequester CO2. So they're taking 4,000 tons of CO2, which is about 790 passenger vehicles off the road. And they're proving sort of out and building out the market for these types of systems. Fervo is also working on some DAC items. So Fervo's received a grant to build out and prove DAC in our Southern Utah project as well. So we're actively working in that space. There's also some other really cool, interesting value stack things you can do with geothermal. You can also use the minerals. We talked about the bad side of if you're pulling things up from the earth, you might have sulfur dioxide or other minerals that are secondary knock-on effects. But you also could get some interesting benefits as well. So one of the things we're seeing with, the technology advancements is an increasing need for lithium. And it turns out that in many of the places where you have good geohydrothermal systems, you also have a high prevalence of lithium, such as the Salton Sea. So California estimates that we might have up to 600,000 tons of lithium could be produced from the Imperial Valley. And there's some really interesting companies that are working on building and developing projects there in the Imperial Valley and extracting the lithium through these processes. I didn't want to only talk about Fervo, so I'll also talk about some other interesting EGS companies. People are doing all kinds of cool things in this space. This is a company called Ever, who is working on a truly closed loop system where they essentially drill a section, very large horizontal wells. These do have to be very long, extremely long laterals, and you do have to have enough surface to have an appropriate heat transfer. But there's a video in the lecture notes. I encourage you to watch it just because it really demonstrates just how far drilling technology has come and some of the really cool things that we can do in more shallow systems. Okay, so who is the biggest player in the space? It remains Ormat. Ormat is the largest geothermal company. I don't work at Ormat, but I respect them tremendously. So they have over 190 power plants, geothermal power plants installed worldwide. Just had a very cool process of being able to talk through and look at some of their equipment for Fervo themselves for one of our projects. And I'll say they definitely have some of the most talented engineers in the space. So, they've got more than 3.2 gigawatts of capacity installed. And I don't know if you guys remember, but we talked about the US having the most capacity installed and that being just under 3 gigawatts. So they essentially, and when we say by a lot, Ormat is the largest producer. They've got a whole bunch of plants in Nevada that are very interesting. There's one in my case study section that's in Hawaii that is an Ormat plant that's really interesting to talk from a whole variety of distant reasons. We can talk about that, the Puna plant. Puna, I'm sure I always mispronounce it. Okay, so Fervo, I mentioned, was able to do sort of this very innovative thing. What is this innovative thing? How did it come about? We need to give credit where credit is due. Fervo is actually really founded on good principles, but is certainly taking advantage of some really great work that the US government has done to advance geothermal. So that in that EGS system where I said we're creating that permeability, there's a project in southern Utah called the Forge Project, and it happens to be a stone throws distance away from Fervo's first commercial project, and that is not by coincidence. This is really the way it should work. I highlighted earlier that Kenya has this program where they help to offset some of the earliest drilling risks. This is another way that governments and societies at large can help proliferate and help geothermal really scale. So what the US government decided to do was to do a grant system and to help prove out some temperature resource and drilling technologies and the sort of horizontal drilling techniques and completions. They did this in conjunction with a university in southern Utah, outside of Milford, called the Forge Project. Fervo then has leases in the direct vicinity, and we're utilizing both their temperature data as well as a lot of their work with the community to now go build one of the largest, we think it will actually be the largest geothermal binary cycle plant in the world just next door, really leveraging some of the results from Forge. So this is really a success story in how public-private partnerships can work together to help scale technology. This is a little bit more about Fervo and how we're doing that. So in case anyone is like a visual person, maybe not an engineer, and my explanation earlier of drilling horizontally and then completing a reservoir didn't make sense, these graphics really help to highlight the difference between what traditional geothermal does and what my company Fervo does. So in traditional geothermal, which is on the for you left-hand side, is drilling essentially a set of production and injection wells. That's represented there by the blue and the orange. And so you're looking for those three, that trifecta. You're drilling down, you're going to find an injection well, and then you're going to drill a production well. And you're looking for the fluid to flow naturally through the porous rock or the permeability there. And you're pulling the water, you're using water that's already usually naturally occurring in the system. You are pulling it up through the production well to that surface equipment. We reviewed how that is then created to electricity. And then you're taking it and you're injecting it back down. But you are relying on that natural system. Fervo's innovation is simply to say, okay, the oil and gas space through the shale revolution has been drilling horizontal and doing completions and creating fractures within subsurface systems now for over 10 years. They've gotten very good at doing this. Why don't we use those same techniques? And why don't we do that for geothermal instead? So by contrast, on your right-hand side, what Fervo does is we drill a set of wells. We drill an injection well and 1 or 2 producer wells. And we do a completions technique where we essentially create a hydrothermal system by fracturing the rock artificially for the fluid to flow through. It's beneficial because essentially we never have any dry hole, what we call where we drill well and all of a sudden your fluid isn't making it back up to your production. It's beneficial for that reason. It's also beneficial because it takes previously sort of unknown things that you're trying to model within the subsurface and makes them an engineering input for you. So you're able to say, okay, like I'm going to be able to better predict how my flow is going to react, how much flow I'm going to get, at what rate, what my temperatures are going to be, because I'm better able to predict how much exposure they're going to have to the heat in the rock. So that's really all Fervo does. Just wanted to give you a little bit of a background in case you want to ask me questions about what we do. That's what I can speak about. Not the only ones doing super interesting things though. This is a project in Iceland that is drilling to incredible depths and showing that's another way to use drilling innovation. Earlier I talked about that to truly get to an economic project, it's all about how cost effectively can you access the geothermal resource. So another way to do that is be able to drill deeper. So this is a very interesting project. Let's go right to questions. And we can use these case studies as demonstration of questions. You want to do that? Because I want to talk about what you guys care about.
Is it common to combine cycles and produce both power and heat?
Yeah, it can be. It can be. It's not super common. In some ways, the binary cycle can lend itself really well to this. In other ways, it can be complicated because your heat source on geothermal, depending on you're usually taking heat from several wells, and depending on how you're managing your field, the temperature may not always be consistent. And so that's historically been the reason why especially extreme precision industrial processes don't necessarily combine, because getting the temperature at a consistent rate is extremely important, usually in industrial processes. For ones where it's less common, like agriculture, particularly greenhouses, much more common. Actually, I personally have visited 5 power plants that have greenhouses like right next door. So that's a lot more common. There's also some really cool, interesting stuff that's happening from, do you guys know about concentrated solar plants? Okay, so just the thermodynamic processes of concentrated solar plants. There's one plant that is using concentrated solar co-located to sort of then reheat back up the fluid. And I've seen some interesting things recently about using concentrated solar to help mitigate those temperature differentials that exist that are kind of a barrier to co-location of direct heat and electricity production. Hi, go ahead.
Has Fervo encountered any seismic activity during their project with Google?
I'm so glad. I knew that going to these would be good. Okay, let's talk about seismic. One of the examples is seismic. So no. The answer is no, unequivocally no. However, Seismic activity can be something that you need to be very, very careful of when you are doing subsurface. And the reason is because one of these plants that I put in here in our case study resulted in an earthquake. So this is a project that when people think of EGS and seismic activities, if they have any demonstrable like thought in their brain, this is one of the things they're thinking of. They're thinking of this project, which is the, I'm gonna really mispronounce this, and if someone knows how to actually pronounce it, please tell me. Pohang? I don't know. It is a project that was an EGS project that one of your professors here at Stanford has shown was caused by stimulation activity. So it is extremely, extremely important when you are dealing in the subsurface and injecting or doing any sort of high pressure activity that you pay attention to seismicity. FERVO has a very, very complex and comprehensive seismic monitoring plan. In fact, Jack Norbeck, who's one of our co-founders, actually developed the U.S. Geological Society's like stoplight system and rubrics at the U.S. Geological Society. That was one of his focuses. So it's extremely important. And what I will say about this is the best way to make sure that you are not causing any induced seismicity is to select your site extremely important. Your site selection is extremely important. When you think about like subsurface, where you're gonna have more risk of induced seismicity is when you're near fault zones. In traditional geothermal, you're actually often near very, very active fault zones because you're looking for permeability, and that's one of the things that it naturally occurs when you have permeability there is fault zones. In EGS project locations, you already have a smaller, lower risk because you're not having to go for those fault zones. And quite frankly, actually, you're trying to stay away from them because when you get into an unknown fault zone, one of the things that can happen is when you're injecting water down into your system, and if you intersect a fault, all of your fluid can go into the fault and not back up through your producer. So it's kind of like you're inherently trying to avoid them. So site selection, extremely important. Actively monitoring during drilling, extremely important. And then understanding and full reservoir engineering and modeling, extremely important. I'll point you to this paper just because I want you guys to see it, because he talks about how essentially that earthquake was caused by that, but that it is extremely avoidable if you develop in the right way. Great question, great question. Yeah.
What are your power needs from the grid, and does FERVO have to buy any credits?
Yeah, sure. No, we self-supply all of our power. So geothermal does have a pretty high parasitic load. It can be as high as 20%, depending on what your well pumping needs are. So that has to be taken into account when you're sizing your project appropriately. Usually they do have what's called a backfeed, where you may have that for emergency startup or something like that. So you may actually have like a backfeed into the grid. But typically geothermal projects completely self-supply their parasitic load. And one of the things that we're seeing deployed almost exclusively for binary cycles right now is co-located solar facilities as well to help offset some of those parasitics. So we don't really do credits because we don't have a mission, but definitely parasitics is part of the economic calculation.